There's one objection in your book that stands out to me where it's the challenge goes something like they just read their Jewish scriptures, the disciples did, to try and invent a story that makes sense out of Jesus' death, and voila, they came up with the resurrection. And I like how you mentioned that because how would that even get into their minds? Right? Thinking about the cultural background, how would they even get into their minds? Some Jews, like the Sadducees, they didn't even believe in resurrection. Other Jews didn't think it could happen until the end of the age. It would never have even entered their minds. So beyond motive, like, would they even think about this?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think that if you look at it realistically, you hear all the time that Jesus is all the dying and rising saviors of antiquity, of the pagan sources on this. So what we're suggesting is that a group of Jews writing and trying to convince other Jews who have been warned as Jews not to worship the gods of any other culture, that we're going to now cobble together a story about God using just the motifs and stories and mythologies of non-Jewish gods in order to convince a group of Jews who have been warned against such things. To me, I don't know where this is going. And it's clear from Scripture that was the desire of the gospel authors. That was the desire of the apostles. That was the desire of those who were moving forward in proclaiming the Christian faith. That the Jews were in there. That was a target group. Okay, so it's not as though, well, yeah, they never intended to convert Jews. Well, it just turns out you're right. They had a story that was probably the least plausible influence story you could create for a Jewish audience. And the reason why they created that story is because they didn't create it at all. It just happened. And then we're stuck with the truth. We're stuck with what really is, even though it may not be the kind of story I would have cobbled together if I was just trying to convince you of something. And that's one of the things I think we can look at and say, well, yeah, that also speaks to the fact that if you wanted to create fiction, you could have created a much more persuasive fiction than the one that everyone claims is fiction now. It just might be that story isn't fiction at all.
Yeah, right. And why would you put women as the first witnesses at the tomb when in that very culture, that would be suspect to them? As why put forth, the very witnesses who in the culture didn't count as much? And I think it's just amazing in God's sovereignty that the people whose voices were marginalized in the community, God used them to be the first ones to proclaim the resurrection.
I mean, you hear all the time that Christianity has a low view of women, but you have to remember the context of the culture in which it was written. It has a quite high view of women, and especially considering that the first readers, before you can do anything with the Gospels, you have to be able to reach the first readers. You're not writing for a future culture that might emerge in 2,000 years. You are writing for the culture that has to start the entire movement. And that's why I think it's important to see that that's really how we have to measure the view of women. I'm one of those guys who doesn't think much about the principle of embarrassment. You hear this all the time. People will use it. What I've discovered is that there are really good liars. I can think of 2 or 3 of my cold case work right now that understand that principle of embarrassment and leverage it well in their own descriptions of lies. Like they'll always include some embarrassing view of themselves because they're trying to convince me this is the truth. So I'm never, but this idea that the authors would use women, that's different. That's not a principle of embarrassment. That is just, a bad choice if you're trying to tell a lie. So I think that is something worth examining.
Yeah, I remember once I was on a jury in Norwalk, actually, in LA County. Part of the case hinged on this guy went back into the house. Why? To change his belt. Why? Because his shoes got dirty. Why would he change his belt? That makes no sense. And yet until someone on the jury was like, no, this is my culture. And in our culture, you don't walk out of the house if your belt doesn't match your shoes. So this makes total sense. And so sometimes understanding those cultural scripts, those cultural backgrounds helps us determine, no, this actually is a really good corroborative piece of data.
That's a great point. You just made, you can make a historical claim clearer by using an analogy from a trial. And that is the kind of thing that we see in the history of Christian case making. Is you will see that evidence demands a verdict. All of these kind of references to criminal trials or to casework in order to make a kind of a case, and to get a lot of it's just based on the Greek word for making a defense, right? That really is the same kind of view that we would hold about making a defense for in front of a jury or in front of a king or in front of some prosecutor. And so this is the kind of thing that we do. So I think this has been helpful. And that's what I'm trying to pass on in this book, not just ideas about how the law might, how legal cases work, but actually experiences where I said, okay, that doesn't work. This does. So we're trying to find, parallels that are actually not just, imagination, they are from our actual casework.
Now, in the end of this book, something I really liked is you had an afterward section where you touch on 12 common questions that you always get asked, and you've spoken at hundreds of events all over the country and maybe even thousands. And what is the number one question that you always get asked at your presentations? What would you say that is?
Well, I think now it's shifted. It's about the goodness of Christianity. Why does Christianity make this claim, which seems so antithetical to this cultural claim, either about gender identity or sexuality or marriage or about abortion, whatever it may be? Those are the ones we're going to get a lot more of. And that's where I see the shift. In the past, it's almost always been some aspect of the problem of evil, like why, and it's always multifaceted. There's all kinds of different kinds of evil. There's moral evil. There's natural evil. There's the evil that people would claim God is actually part of in the pages of the Old Testament, those kinds of things. So that's how it used to be. But, from the limited, what I try to do with those 12 is to stay with the case for the reliability of the New Testament. So this book is really about this narrow claim. And those claims, what I see a lot is, number one, this rejection of supernatural. And that drives a lot of skepticism. The idea that the Gospels could not have been written early because they include predictions of things that actually came true, like the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Therefore, they would have to have been written after the destruction of the temple because no one could actually guess that right unless it already happened. Although there's no manuscript evidence to suggest that claim is true. In other words, there's not as though we have manuscripts that can demonstrate that. That's based on a presupposition against prophecy. Or the other one, which is that, these miracles could not have happened. They would have to wait until everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can write anything you want about Jesus and his miracles because there's no one to tell you you're a liar. And if you write these things early enough, within 20 to 30 to 40 years of the events, there would still be people who would know if he really fed 5,000, if he really did those things. So that's why you see a lot of skepticism based on a bias against the supernatural dates the Gospels much later than I think they ought to be dated. And if you think about it, really that late dating didn't occur. It's probably only about 250 years old in terms of scholarship. That the most skepticism about early dating has occurred. So I think in the end, those are some of the ones I get the most of. Like, why would I believe this is really early? Why do I believe the gospel miracles actually occurred? That kind of thing. But aside from that, the larger ones are going to be about the goodness of Christianity or theism generally, and the problem of evil and and that's always got different views, right? It could be any number of things, including current events that would cause somebody to think, well, and I can tell you, that's not unusual when you work as a detective, because every Christian victim's family is going to ask, why would God allow that to happen to my daughter? Why would God allow any of this to happen? So those are not conversations I haven't had before, but they're difficult conversations. And they're much more nuanced. I can ask the question in 10 seconds? It might take 15 minutes to even begin to cover some of the reasons why God might allow any act of evil.
Yeah.
Where I think some of these are just to be honest, these are not 1-minute answers.
That's right.
They're going to be a much more involved kind of an answer, which is why I think if you're somebody who's like you and I, we are authors and we are writers and we are podcasters, but we don't lead large ministries. It's hard because I'll get an email. I get a bunch of emails I wish I could spend time answering, but it's like, wow, I don't have the bandwidth to do it. So I think it's a challenge. And you try to create videos and do those things, which really you have some email in mind when you did the video, because you knew there's no way I could answer 20 emails, but I might be able to do something online. So